90% of what is out there is conspiracy-oriented. You can talk about all the theories you want, but this thing happened only one way.
Dale Myers is a computer animator who has been studying the assassination for more than 25 years. To advance the analysis of the crime, Myers has generated an exacting computer simulation of the Zapruder film. He began by constructing a three-dimensional scale model of Dealey Plaza, the turn from Houston Street onto Elm Street, the Texas School Book Depository, the grassy knoll. They are all reconstructed exactly the way they were in 1963. On top of the Zapruder film, he then animated the movements of President Kennedy and Governor Connally frame by frame. When all of these elements come together, we can now leave the place where Zapruder was filming and see the shooting from any point of view, each one an accurate representation of precisely what happened. If the crime were committed today, forensic investigators would unquestionably use this technique.
Let's take a look at Abraham Zapruder's film in detail. Let's orient ourselves first off. Zapruder, of course, is standing on a 4.5-foot high pedestal just west of the book depository. So he's looking up toward the corner. The limousine has just finished and completed its turn and starting to glide down Elm Street. Frame 133 is the first frame in which the president appears. As we advance the frames here, around frame 160 is approximately the time of the first shot, and apparently a shot that missed. Governor Connally said that he was looking to the left side of the car. He heard a shot, immediately identified it as a high-powered rifle shot, and so he said he turned to his right because the sound seemed to come from over his right shoulder. And so we see him right here, looking to his left. And in the next couple of frames, we see his head turn, and now he's looking to his right. So it's a very quick head snap, quarter of a second, like this. Now the car glides down toward the Stemmons Freeway sign. The car disappears for a moment. We see Governor Connally emerge first from behind the sign. He does not appear to be injured. Next frame, 223. You can see the white shirt. You can see his jacket. You can see a little bit of gray area where his tie is. And something happens between frame 223 and 224. We can really pinpoint the moment that the bullet strikes. Watch the jacket. You notice it changes shape. It's almost as if the jacket has popped out a little bit, kind of bulged out. Before, after. Before, and after. In fact, a bullet has struck him in the right back. It has emerged about an inch below his nipple, blowing about a 2-inch ragged hole. In the next frame, the president comes out from behind the sign. We see kind of an anguished look on his face, and his hands immediately go up toward his throat, and they come up in a guarded manner, and the elbows rise in a very dramatic and a very high fashion. So he's kind of like this. But you'll note that both men are reacting simultaneously.
This moment gives rise to what is called the single bullet theory, that the second shot hit both men, passing through the president and into the governor. This is challenged by those who say that President Kennedy and Governor Connally were hit by different bullets from different guns, and two guns would make a conspiracy.
Here we have President Kennedy and Governor Connally at the moment of the second shot. This is the moment they're hit, the equivalent of Zapruder frame 223. As we know, President Kennedy was struck in the upper right back. He had another bullet wound in his throat. It was believed to have passed through his throat, moving back to front. Governor Connally, struck in the right back, just near the armpit. That bullet emerged, his right chest, about 1 inch below the nipple line. When we look at their positions, based on the Zapruder film, this is exactly how they were seated at that moment, at frame 223. Governor Connally sitting slightly inboard of the president. In addition to that, he's turned sharply to his right. You can already see from this that any bullet striking the president in the upper right back and emerging out of his throat, that bullet is going to continue forward, and it's going to hit Governor Connally exactly where he was hit. Connally has to be hit, and the fact that they both react at the same time clinches it. So, it's not a magic bullet at all. It's not even a single bullet theory, in my opinion. It's a single bullet fact.
So if President Kennedy and Governor Connally were hit from behind by the same bullet, where did it come from? Using the men's body positions and the locations of their wounds, Myers can isolate the source of the shot.
We could start with, for instance, Governor Connolly's entrance wound on his back, connect that with the point of exit on the president's throat, and then take that line and project it rearward. What we end up with is a line that goes right back through the sniper's nest window, the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository.
I have the greatest respect for Robert Blakey, but I cannot join him in this hypothesis.
Committee calls Mr. Salerno.
The late Ralph Salerno knew as much about organized crime as anyone in America. He was hired by Blakey to be the committee's mob expert. He thought his former boss's theory was wrong.
The theory is Ruby is taking out Oswald, so Oswald can't say anything. Somebody has to take out Ruby, so he can't say anything. And then somebody has to take out the guy who took Ruby out. It becomes an unending dilemma, so it doesn't work quite that way.
Mr. Genovese was at that meeting, Mr. Giancana?
I reviewed for the committee the electronic surveillances that the FBI had in on organized crime figures all over the country, and there was no indication at all of their involvement. Since that time, up to the current day, you have had a large number of high-level members of organized crime have made a deal with the government and testified against their fellows. None of them has ever suggested that they knew of or even heard of involvement by organized crime in the death of President Kennedy.
There were 3,000 pieces of evidence. Firearms tests showed that the bullets which hit the president could only have come from Oswald's rifle. His palm print was on the stock. His prints were on the boxes in the sniper's position at the book depository. The commission found persuasive evidence that President Kennedy and Governor Connolly had been hit by the same bullet. The commission concluded that Lee Oswald acted alone. There was no evidence, the Warren Commission said, of a conspiracy. But when the commission published its report in September 1964, many Americans simply did not believe it.
I think there were more involved in it than just Oswald.
I think that he was working for the CIA, myself.
I don't think that all the facts were brought out.
The commission was accused of covering up a conspiracy.
The accusation that we had a predetermined idea to find that there was no conspiracy and that Oswald was the assassin is completely false. Let me say to you that the one thing I wanted to do was find a conspiracy. I was a 32-year-old lawyer at that point, and I had political ambitions. If I could have found that Oswald didn't do it, I'd have been the senator from Ohio and not John Glenn.
I would say we did a thorough search, and we discovered all of the evidence. And I think the best proof is it's 40 years later, and nobody's come up with any statement of anybody else who did it.
There has not been a single piece of credible evidence to prove a conspiracy.
I have to admit to you, at the beginning, I did think there was a conspiracy. But when you honestly take a look at it, you honestly pursue every avenue, at some point you have to be honest with yourself. I don't care how much you want it, believe it, feel it, whatever else. At some point you have to say, there is no evidence.
I know that millions and millions of people in this country believe there was a conspiracy. People want to believe that the world is not that random, that things are not that chaotic, that something larger, bigger, was at stake here. Because I think it's very difficult for them to accept the idea that someone as inconsequential as Oswald could have killed someone as consequential as Kennedy.
Those of us who have worked on this project know that millions of people, all these years later, still have a hard time accepting that it was Oswald alone. William Manchester, who wrote Death of a President, identified this yearning for a better answer. If, he says, to use an odd metaphor, you put 6 million murdered Jews on one side of the scale and the Nazi regime on the other, you have a rough balance. Greatest crime, greatest criminals. But if you put the murdered president on one side of the scale and that wretched waif Oswald, as Manchester calls him, on the other, it doesn't balance. You want to add some weight to Oswald. It would invest the president's death with meaning. Kennedy would have died for something. Manchester says a conspiracy would do the job nicely. I'm Peter Jennings. Good night.